The first sign disappeared on a Tuesday. The second, on Friday. By the time Carol Henderson from the HOA ripped down my 7th private property marker, I'd had enough.
"You can't stop progress, Mr. Mitchell," she smirked, tossing my grandfather's handcrafted sign into her luxury SUV. After $112,000 in bogus fines and threats to annex my century-old farmland, I installed sign number 8, with 12 volts of American Justice wired through its metal frame. The look on Carol's face when electricity surged through her manicured fingertips was priceless.
But my shocking defense of constitutional property rights came at a cost. Did I cleverly protect my heritage? Or electrocute myself straight into a lawsuit that could cost me everything?
Standing at my property line, I can still hear my grandfather's voice from 40 years ago.
"Remember, son, a man's right to his land is sacred in America."
For 3 generations, my family has worked this 5-acre property in Oaked County, where my grandfather built our farmhouse with calloused hands in 1954.
This land isn't just dirt and grass. It's my family's legacy.
That all changed 3 years ago when bulldozers from Meadowrest Estates started tearing up the neighboring farmland.
Within months, cookie-cutter mansions sprouted where corn once grew.
Then came the letters. Thick envelopes with gold-embossed HOA logos, welcoming me to their association. According to some obscure zoning technicality, my family's homestead had been incorporated into their jurisdiction. I tossed those letters where they belonged, in my wood-burning stove, the same one my grandfather built. But then came the threatening notices with red violation stamps.
My weathered barn was an eyesore. My 1963 John Deere tractor was improperly stored equipment.
My chicken coop violated their livestock ordinances.
But the real nightmare began when Carol Henderson became HOA president.
I still remember the day she marched onto my porch in her designer heels, diamond earrings catching the sun as she looked down her nose at my home. "Mr. Mitchell," she said with a smile that never reached her eyes, "as a former corporate attorney, I specialize in problem properties, and your little farm is officially problem number 1. She handed me a thick binder labeled Meadowrest Estates Homeowners Association Bylaws and Architectural Guidelines, with dozens of colored tabs marking supposed violations. The fees totaled more than my annual pension. "This property has historical significance," I explained, showing her the framed certificate from the County Historical Society that hung by my door.
"It's exempt from incorporation into new developments." Carol's laugh was sharp as a knife.
"That exemption expired when the county rezoned last year.
Check section 12.4 of your property tax assessment."
She pulled a glossy brochure from her leather portfolio. "We're planting a beautiful community garden right where this eyesore of a barn stands. You should be grateful, we're increasing your property value." As she drove away in her gleaming white SUV, I noticed something missing. The private property sign that had marked my eastern boundary for decades. In its place stood a small Meadowrest Estates marker. The war had begun. The first confrontation. It happened on a Sunday morning when I caught Carol and 2 HOA board members physically removing my newly reinstalled property sign. "Excuse me," I said, trying to remain calm despite my racing heart. "You're on private property, and you're removing my boundary marker."
Carol didn't even look up from her clipboard.
"This signage violates Section 8.3 of the HOA bylaws, no unauthorized signage visible from community roadways." "This isn't your jurisdiction," I explained, handing her a copy of my original deed.
"My property predates your development by 67 years.
She smiled that cold, practiced smile. "Actually, Mr. Mitchell, according to county records, your property was rezoned last year. You're subject to our regulations now."
She nodded to her associates, who continued uprooting my sign.
"That's theft and trespassing," I said, my voice finally betraying my anger. Carol tilted her head. "Feel free to attend our next board meeting to air your grievances. Tuesday at 7 p.m., Meadowcrest Clubhouse."
She handed me another violation notice. "And please remove that tractor by Wednesday.
It's an additional $250 per day until compliance is achieved."
I installed a new sign the next day.
This one, cemented 3 feet into the ground.
It disappeared by noon.
I put up another, bolted to a metal post.
Gone by morning. This pattern continued for weeks. Each sign, more secure than the last.
Each one, mysteriously vanishing when I wasn't home. After installing a hidden camera disguised as a birdhouse, I caught Carol and her crew red-handed, physically sawing through the metal post of my sixth sign. When I showed the footage to Sheriff Davis, he looked away uncomfortably.
"James, I sympathize," he said, sighing. "But this is a civil matter. I suggest you get a lawyer." $3,000 of my retirement savings later, my attorney Wilson's expression told me everything before he even spoke.
"They're operating in a legal gray area that would shock most Americans," he said, sliding my documents back across his polished desk. "Your property should be exempt based on historical status, but fighting this will cost upwards of $50,000.
HOAs have deep pockets and attorneys on retainer. So they can just take my land?" My voice cracked. "Land my family has owned for generations?" Wilson closed his notebook with a snap. "It happens every day across America. My advice? Either comply or sell before they bankrupt you with fines."
That night, I sat on my darkening porch, watching what might be one of my last sunsets as the owner of Mitchell Farm.
The weight of defeat pressed on my shoulders. Until Martha's motorized scooter hummed up my driveway, a plate of cookies balanced perfectly on her lap. "I saw that HOA witch on your property again today," she said, handing me the cookies.
"My nephew lost his house to an HOA in Florida last year.
Started with fines for his grass being too long.
Ended with foreclosure.
These people are worse than the bank." I bit into a cookie, Martha's famous snickerdoodles. "What would you do, Martha?"
Her eyes, clouded with cataracts but sharp with wisdom, narrowed. "My Harold would have found a way to protect what's his. Sometimes you need to fight fire with fire."
She patted my hand.
"Or find something even more surprising.
The plan."
By month 3, the situation was out of hand.
My mailbox overflowed with violation notices.
I'd received over $112,000 in fines for continuous noncompliance.
My teacher's pension couldn't cover a fraction of it.
The breaking point came when I returned home to find Carol supervising a team of landscapers on my property. They had already removed a 200-year-old oak tree that my grandfather had proposed to my grandmother under.
In its place stood a sign. "Future site of Meadowrest Community Garden." "What have you done?" I demanded, my voice breaking at the sight of the fallen oak. Carol consulted her clipboard. "Hazardous vegetation removal, authorized by the board last Tuesday. You would have known had you attended the meeting." She handed me another notice. "This also serves as notification that your continued non-compliance has triggered Bylaw 14.2 Property Rehabilitation Intervention." Meaning what, exactly?
The HOA now has the right to enter and modify non-compliant properties.
"We've hired contractors to begin barn removal next week."
She pointed to a surveyor marking boundaries with yellow stakes 20 feet into what had always been my land. "The new survey, commissioned by the board, has adjusted your property line. This will all be community space soon." I knew their survey was fabricated. My hands trembled with anger as I took photographs of the fallen tree, the markers, and Carol's smug expression.
That night, I couldn't sleep.
The image of my grandfather's oak lying in pieces haunted me.
Generations of my family had worked this land. Protected it. Cherished it. Now, I was being erased.
The next morning, I found tire tracks across my front garden and my mailbox smashed.
Inside the damaged box was a formal notice. Meadowrest Estates vs. Mitchell.
A court date for a property lien hearing.
They weren't just trying to bully me with fines.
They were attempting to legally seize my land. I tried one last official channel, driving to the county records office with my original deed, historical designation papers, and family photographs documenting our ownership since the 1950s.
The clerk was sympathetic but helpless.
"There was a county rezoning last year that affected several historical properties," she explained, showing me documents signed by commissioners I had never heard of. The public hearings were announced in the County Gazette.
The Gazette that shut down 5 years ago? I asked incredulously.
She had the grace to look embarrassed. They placed a legal notice in the replacement publication.
Technically, it fulfilled notification requirements.
I left with photocopies of the rezoning documents, my thoughts darker than they'd ever been. The system designed to protect property owners was being weaponized against us.
And I was running out of legal options.
That evening, Martha rolled by in her motorized scooter as I hammered in my seventh sign, this one reinforced with steel and concrete. "Won't work," she said flatly. That woman had 3 men remove the last one with power tools.
Took less than 5 minutes.
"I have to try something," I replied, wiping sweat from my forehead. Martha wheeled closer, her voice dropping to a whisper.
Harold was an electrical engineer.
Worked for the power company for 42 years. She placed a worn, leather-bound book in my hands.
His project notebook. Page 63 might interest you. That night, I found it. Perimeter security systems, non-lethal deterrence. Harold had detailed electrical circuits designed to protect rural properties from predators, both animal and human. With my background teaching physics for 30 years, I understood every diagram. And an idea began to form.
That night, I sat at my grandfather's oak table, the very one where he'd signed the original deed to this land, surrounded by useless legal documents and mounting HOA fines. My hands trembled with anger as I looked at the framed photo of 3 generations of Mitchells standing proudly by our property marker.
Something had to be done. Harold's notebook lay open before me, illuminated by my father's old desk lamp.
The electrical deterrence systems he designed were ingenious. Originally created to keep coyotes from livestock without causing permanent harm. One design, in particular, caught my attention. A metal contact circuit that delivered a surprising but safe jolt similar to livestock fencing but triggered only by specific actions.
The next morning, I visited my old friend Ed at Mitchell's Hardware.
The bell jingled as I entered, and Ed looked up from helping Mrs. Caldwell with her garden supplies. "James, you look like a man with a mission," Ed called out, immediately abandoning the fertilizer discussion when he saw my expression.
After Mrs. Caldwell left, I leaned in close.
"I need something special, Ed, something to protect what's mine." I showed him Harold's diagrams, explaining what I needed, a way to deliver a surprising but safe jolt of electricity to anyone tampering with my property sign.
Ed's eyes lit up.
His family had lost their west pasture to Metarest's legal maneuvering last year.
"Like a cattle fence?"
Ed asked, a slow grin spreading across his weathered face.
"Exactly," I replied.
"But portable.
And focused just on the metal sign."
"Wait here," Ed said, disappearing into the back room. He returned with items not displayed on the regular shelves, a compact 12-volt battery, specialized wiring, and a pulse generator, similar to those used in livestock fencing. "On the house," Ed said when I reached for my wallet.
"Consider it a community service."
"Those HOA vultures tried to find me for my store sign last month. I spent the rest of the day in my barn, working with tools my father had used decades before. By sunset, I had created a masterpiece of defensive engineering. A new, larger private property, no trespassing sign with a hidden surprise. The sign itself was metal, with a wooden frame designed to look vintage and handcrafted, something that would particularly irritate Carol's aesthetic sensibilities. The metal sign itself became the conductor, while the wooden frame remained safe to touch. Inside the post, I concealed the battery and wiring, designing the system to activate only when someone tried to forcibly remove the sign from its mount.
Simply touching the sign would do nothing. It required the specific action of trying to remove it. For safety's sake, I tested it on myself first. Touching the sign normally produced no effect. But when I tugged at it as if to remove it, the shock made me yelp and jump back. It wasn't dangerous as comparable to touching a doorknob after shuffling across carpet in winter, but it was definitely memorable. Perfect.
As darkness fell, I installed the sign at my property line, carefully concealing the wires and ensuring everything looked completely normal. The camera birdhouse was repositioned for a clear view, now supplemented by a second camera hidden in a nearby tree hollow. Before heading inside, I stood for a moment in the quiet darkness, my hand resting safely on my new sign.
This wasn't just about a boundary marker anymore. This was about drawing a line that couldn't be crossed.
A stand for all the Marthas and EDS being bullied by people who thought money and legal maneuvering trumped basic human decency. "Grandpa," I whispered to the stars above, "I hope I'm doing right by your land." As if an answer, a cool breeze rustled through the leaves of the remaining oak trees, and I felt a strange sense of peace.
Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring.
But tonight, I was ready.
The incident. Monday morning dawned bright and clear.
I followed my usual routine, leaving for the grocery store at 10 a.m., the time Carol's previous sign removal operations had typically begun. But today, my phone was set up to receive live alerts from my hidden cameras. And I parked just down the road, out of sight, but close enough to return quickly.
At 10:34 a.m. precisely, the familiar white Metarest Estates SUV pulled alongside my property. My heart raced as I watched Carol emerge in her formal business attire. White blouse beneath a navy blazer, catching the morning sun.
Two reluctant-looking landscapers in Metarest uniforms followed, carrying tools. Through my phone screen, I could hear Carol clearly, her voice carrying in the morning air.
"This area needs to be cleared immediately," she instructed, gesturing with her clipboard toward my property.
"The community garden groundbreaking is scheduled for Saturday, and that hideous sign needs to go first. The photographer from Luxury Living magazine will be here Thursday."
I zoomed in on the camera feed.
One of the workers approached my sign cautiously, examining it. "Ma'am, this is pretty serious," he muttered. "It says private property, no trespassing.
Violators will be prosecuted. And I'm telling you it's HOA land now." Carol snapped, consulting her clipboard.
"We have a new survey right here. This is officially Metarest Estates common area."
The second worker squinted at the sign. "Wasn't this the property where we removed 6 other signs already? Maybe we should double-check the..." "Are you questioning my authority?" Carol's voice dropped to a dangerous tone. "Your company's contract with Metarest is up for renewal next month. I'd hate to recommend termination over such a simple task."
The men exchanged uncomfortable glances. The older one shook his head slightly.
"With all due respect, ma'am, we don't feel comfortable removing this. It's clearly marked private property, and the owner seems pretty serious." Carol's face flushed with anger, her perfectly manicured hand tightening around her clipboard. "For heaven's sake, do I have to do everything myself?"
She thrust her clipboard at the younger worker.
"Hold this. I'll show you how it's done." Here is the next 6,000 plus words of the voiceover text, formatted with proper punctuation for clarity. Carol marched purposefully toward my sign, designer heels sinking slightly into the soft earth.
Her face was set in determined lines, jaw tight with frustration. She reached the sign and ran her hand dismissively over its surface.
"Honestly, it's not even properly finished. Look at this amateur craftsmanship."
She grasped the edge of the metal sign with one hand while bracing against the post with the other, preparing to wrench it free.
That's when it happened.
The moment her fingers wrapped firmly around the edge of the metal sign to yank it free, the circuit completed. The effect was instantaneous. A visible spark leaped from the sign to her hand.
Carol's body jerked backward, eyes widening in shock, mouth forming a perfect O of surprise. Her clipboard went flying as she stumbled back, staring at her hand in disbelief.
"What in the..." she gasped, her professional composure completely shattered.
"He electrified it. The sign is electrified."
Her voice rose with each word, drawing the attention of both landscapers.
One of the landscapers jumped back, breaking into uncontrolled laughter before quickly disguising it as a cough.
The other simply stood there, mouth agape, eyes darting between Carol and the seemingly innocent metal sign now sparking slightly in the morning sun.
This is assault," Carol shrieked, her perfectly manicured hand trembling as she pointed at the sign.
Her face had gone from shock to furious, 2 bright red spots of anger blooming on her cheeks.
"Call the sheriff. Now. I want this man arrested. This is criminal." But the workers were already backing toward their truck, hands raised defensively. "Ma'am, with all due respect, we're landscapers, not electricians. And frankly, we don't get paid enough to deal with booby-trapped property lines.
Carol's rage turned toward them.
Cowards! You're all fired.
I'll handle this myself. Let's just say you're not alone anymore.
The sheriff's visit. At 7:30 a.m. the next morning, Sheriff Davis's cruiser rolled up my driveway. I invited him in for coffee. He'd been a student in my physics class 20 years earlier.
Tom, I began, as he tugged uncomfortably at his collar, Mrs. Henderson is pressing charges for assault with a dangerous device.
She's demanding an arrest. I nodded calmly and reached for my laptop.
Before we discuss that, would you like to see what actually happened? The security footage showed Carol trespassing, explicitly ordering workers to remove my property marker, and then attempting to remove it herself. And regarding this dangerous device, I continued, leading him outside to the sign. I touched it safely with my bare hand.
The sign is perfectly harmless unless someone tries to forcibly remove it. I showed him the simple circuit identical to the livestock fencing used by every farmer in the county. Sheriff Davis's face transformed from concern to amusement. You know what this reminds me of, Mr. Mitchell?
That classroom demonstration you did with the Van de Graaff generator, the one that made Principal Wilson's toupee fly off.
He chuckled, shaking his head.
Technically, she was trespassing.
And attempting to remove your property. I'll explain the situation to Mrs. Henderson personally.
That conversation must have been spectacular. Because 3 hours later, Carol's luxury SUV screeched to a halt at my property line. She stayed in her vehicle, screaming threats through her partially open window.
You think this is over?
I have connections with county officials you've never even heard of.
You'll be lucky if you don't lose this entire property. What she didn't notice.
Her tirade was being filmed by at least 5 Meadowrest residents who had coincidentally decided to take afternoon walks past my farm.
By sunset, my phone wouldn't stop ringing.
Is it true you electrified your sign to stop Carol? One Meadowrest resident asked, barely containing her glee. My $500 fine for an unapproved mailbox color just mysteriously disappeared from my account.
The following morning brought 2 surprises. A certified letter from the HOA's attorney acknowledging a misunderstanding about my property boundaries. And a petition on my porch.
142 signatures, nearly every Meadowrest household, demanding an emergency vote to remove Carol Henderson as HOA president. At 7 p.m. that Friday evening, I stepped into the Meadowcrest clubhouse, a place I had previously been told I was prohibited from entering. The room was packed with over 200 residents. As I entered, a murmur ran through the crowd.
Several people actually applauded.
Carol sat rigid at the front table, flanked by 2 uncomfortable-looking board members. When she saw me, her face contorted with rage.
This man has no right to be here, she snapped. He doesn't even live in Meadowcrest.
Let's just say you're not alone anymore.
The sheriff's visit. At 7:30 a.m. the next morning, Sheriff Davis's cruiser rolled up my driveway. I invited him in for coffee. He'd been a student in my physics class 20 years earlier.
Tom, I began, as he tugged uncomfortably at his collar, Mrs. Henderson is pressing charges for assault with a dangerous device.
She's demanding an arrest. I nodded calmly and reached for my laptop.
Before we discuss that, would you like to see what actually happened? The security footage showed Carol trespassing, explicitly ordering workers to remove my property marker, and then attempting to remove it herself. And regarding this dangerous device, I continued, leading him outside to the sign. I touched it safely with my bare hand.
The sign is perfectly harmless unless someone tries to forcibly remove it. I showed him the simple circuit identical to the livestock fencing used by every farmer in the county. Sheriff Davis's face transformed from concern to amusement. You know what this reminds me of, Mr. Mitchell?
That classroom demonstration you did with the Van de Graaff generator, the one that made Principal Wilson's toupee fly off.
He chuckled, shaking his head.
Technically, she was trespassing.
And attempting to remove your property. I'll explain the situation to Mrs. Henderson personally.
That conversation must have been spectacular. Because 3 hours later, Carol's luxury SUV screeched to a halt at my property line. She stayed in her vehicle, screaming threats through her partially open window.
You think this is over? I have connections with county officials you've never even heard of. You'll be lucky if you don't lose this entire property. What she didn't notice. Her tirade was being filmed by at least 5 Meadowrest residents who had coincidentally decided to take afternoon walks past my farm. By sunset, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Is it true you electrified your sign to stop Carol? One Meadowrest resident asked, barely containing her glee. My $500 fine for an unapproved mailbox color just mysteriously disappeared from my account. The following morning brought 2 surprises. A certified letter from the HOA's attorney acknowledging a misunderstanding about my property boundaries. And a petition on my porch. 142 signatures, nearly every Meadowrest household, demanding an emergency vote to remove Carol Henderson as HOA president. At 7 p.m. that Friday evening, I stepped into the Meadowcrest clubhouse, a place I had previously been told I was prohibited from entering. The room was packed with over 200 residents. As I entered, a murmur ran through the crowd. Several people actually applauded. Carol sat rigid at the front table, flanked by 2 uncomfortable-looking board members. When she saw me, her face contorted with rage. "This man has no right to be here," she snapped. "He doesn't even live in Meadowcrest." Richard Cooper, a retired judge who had recently moved to Meadowrest, stood. "Actually, according to your own documentation submitted to the county, his property was incorporated into Meadowrest last year, giving him full voting rights." He smiled thinly. "You can't have it both ways, Carol." The vote took less than 20 minutes. Carol Henderson was removed as HOA president by a margin of 198 to 2. Richard Cooper was elected interim president. And his first official act? To formally exempt my property from all HOA regulations.